Let's talk a little bit more about these carrier contracts, the differences between a shipment contract and a destination contract. Shipment contracts require the seller to use a carrier to deliver the goods. Contracts for the sale of goods are considered shipment contracts unless the parties have stated otherwise. Therefore, on your exam, if there is a contract involved and the contract does not mention whether it's a shipment contract or a destination contract, the default rule says they are shipment contracts. And with a shipment contract, the seller completes its performance by placing the goods in the hands of the carrier. The seller will bear the risk of loss until the seller delivers the goods to the carrier, meaning while they're still on the loading dock, or while they are being loaded onto the first carrier's vessel. Risk of loss, however, transfers when the goods are placed in the hands of the first carrier. Destination contracts require the seller to deliver the goods to a specified destination. In these contracts, and this must be set out in the contract, the seller completes performance when the goods have been delivered at the specified destination. Risk of loss does not pass to the buyer until the time of tender of the goods, tender of delivery, so long as the goods conform to the contract. This means that if goods are damaged while in the hands of the carrier, the semi-truck carrying the goods slips off the road because of ice, the seller is going to bear the risk of loss. So destination contracts. A destination contract will specify that the goods are to be delivered to a specified destination. With destination contracts, risk of loss does not pass from the seller to the buyer until the goods reach the destination. Breach of contract, we said risk of loss has some special rules when there's a breach of contract. If the buyer has failed to deliver conforming goods, if the seller has failed to deliver conforming goods, the buyer may accept those goods as they are or reject the goods, subject to the seller's right to cure, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Risk of loss remains with the seller until the buyer accepts goods or until the deficiencies are corrected. So if I, as a seller, deliver non-conforming goods, goods that do not conform with the contract, I retain the risk of loss until such time as the buyer takes the goods as is, or until the buyer rejects the goods. If the goods are so non-conforming that a buyer rejects them, the risk of loss does not pass until the defects are cured. Say the seller breaches and the buyer accepts those non-conforming goods. If a buyer accepts the goods and then later discovers the defect, the buyer has the right to revoke its acceptance, at which point the risk of loss passes back to the seller. What about buyer breach? Buyer refuses to accept conforming goods and then the goods are later lost or damaged. Well, again, we know risk of loss depends on the type of contract between the buyer or the seller. In the absence of contractual language, the risk of loss will immediately shift to the buyer. However, the buyer will only bear the risk of loss for a reasonable time, a commercially reasonable time. So, in conclusion, what did we look at today? Understanding title and understanding identification. We must know when the insurable interest is created so that the parties can protect themselves from risk of loss. And we know at what point title passes and at what point risk of loss passes. And we know that depends on the terms of the contract. All right, that's it for this one. We'll take up next time with performance.